Welcome to this keynote presentation, Bringing Main Street Back to Life with Mary Rowe. This session is made possible thanks to the generous sponsorship of MNP. Thank you for joining us today. This is one of more than 30 sessions to make up Rising Economy Week, an immersive week-long virtual event co-hosted by the South Island Prosperity Partnership and the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. My name is Kathy Witcher, and I'm the Executive Director of the Urban Development Institute Capital Region. I had the absolute pleasure of meeting Mary Rowe back in early March of this year, just before we went into lockdown with COVID. And I was awestruck by Mary's passion and compassion for cities. So we are very fortunate today to have Mary share with us her perspective on the value of our main streets and how to build them back after the devastation of COVID. A little background on Mary. Mary is a leading urban advocate and social society leader who has worked in cities across Canada and the US. Mary comes to the Canadian Urban Institute with several years of experience as an urban advocate and community leader, including serving as Executive Vice President of the Municipal Art Society of New York, one of America's oldest civic and advocacy organizations built on the built environment. A mid-career fellowship with the US-based Blue Moon Fund led Mary to New Orleans, where she worked with national philanthropy, governments, and local communities to support rebuilding after Hurricane Katrina. Prior to that, Mary was president of the Canadian platform Ideas That Matter, a convening and publishing program based on the work of renowned urbanist Jane Jacobs. Mary has been a frequent contributor to national and international city building programs, including UN Habitat and the World Urban Forum. She brings an extensive international network of practitioners from government, industry, community activism, and city building professions to strengthen the Canadian Urban Institute under her leadership. So Mary, it's your time to wow us, so over to you.
Well, thanks, Kathy. I'm delighted to be back with you and to be with the community in the South Island. Kieran, your producer, I was thinking as I was listening to him, he could be on the other South Island because of his lovely accent. One of the great things about Victoria, the mayor brought to my attention that Monocle has listed Victoria as one of the best small communities to live in. And I wrote her back and said, well, you know, being heralded in Monocle is kind of a mixed blessing, you know. Just because of the nature of that publication. But I noticed, I just skimmed it this morning to see, and sure enough, Victoria is the only, I think it's the only, certainly the only Canadian city cited here, and it's the only North American city, maybe even. And my gripe with these big international indices is that they tend to favor European cities, just saying, and they don't always value the same kinds of things that I think we value, which is why bringing back Main Street is so critically important. You know, Main Streets are about who we are as culture. They're about our neighborhoods. They're about the fundamental building block of community. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of us took our main streets for granted before COVID. And in fact, main streets were declining in monetary terms. And we were starting to sort of see a pattern. So planners have been on this for a while, and economists have been too. And certainly the real estate sector is aware of how commercial real estate actually functions and how those challenges manifest on main streets. But the point that I'm going to make, and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the work we've been doing on this at CUI. The point that I want to make is that this is about more than just commercial life. This is actually about who we are, what kinds of places are we creating, and hopefully I'm going to be able to show this to you properly. Let's just see if it will let me show it to you that way. Hope so. Hopefully can you see it, Kathy? Is that showing you a nice big blue screen? Called Bring Back Main Street. So when we started this campaign called Bring Back Main Street, we tried to make the point, this isn't actually just about the businesses. It's about the civic commons. It's about creating social capital and social cohesion. And it's about manifesting in your local neighborhood all the ingredients that make urban life work. So commercial activity, recreational activity, cultural activity, on your main street, you may actually go to worship there. You may just go to hang there, or you may actually live there. You may be a street involved person, and the street is an important element of your survival. And what we're seeing during COVID, and I've been suggesting this for some time now, I've stolen a term that my colleague at New York University used many years ago, a particle accelerator. He was describing the impact of a heat wave in Chicago in the mid 90s that killed hundreds of people, and realizing that the pre-existing conditions that were present in Chicago neighborhoods then contributed to who lived and who died during that heat wave. And the same is true for us during COVID, that the parts of our community that are well planned and have a balance of amenities are faring much better than parts of our community that have not been well planned, where there's overcrowding, and where the income distribution is not, where there just isn't wealth and there aren't community supports. So not just money, but there aren't community supports. So I think this is a tough moment for urbanists. And I think all of us are urbanists. Anybody that lives in a city or cares about a city is an urbanist. And we've got to really summon all our energies and our intellect and our imagination to think about what's going to happen as we continue to cope with COVID over the next several months. And then how are we going to emerge from this? There's always this tendency when you're in the middle of a disaster, I've worked in a few of them, where we're going to build back better. What happens often is we don't build back better. We tend to snap back into what was. And some of that is nostalgia. Some of that is, I really liked it when it was, but you've got to remember that what wasn't so great for lots of folks. So we have to resist that temptation to not just move to a nostalgic place. And even Bring Back Main Street has an element there of nostalgia, that it's all going to look like what some small town looked like when we were kids. Really what we should have said is we want to bring forward Main Street, and what it's going to do in that particle accelerator notion is it exposes all the dysfunction that existed in our communities prior to COVID, but it can also expose extraordinary strengths and assets. And how do we build on those? And so I'm anticipating that everybody on this session has something to contribute to imagining how do we take this great asset called a Main Street and create a future for it. So if you think about why Main Streets matter, they're essential to the economy, as I suggested. If you think of a municipal tax base, that's property taxes, and businesses along main streets are extraordinarily important to property tax. And this is one of the great challenges municipal governments are facing now. They're running out of money. They're already out of money. And they have so many extraordinary expectations that are placed on them through COVID. They've had to ramp up emergency services. They've had to improvise like crazy. Puts enormous pressure on people working for municipal government. So if you've got a neighbor or cousin or friend who's working for municipal government, you need to phone them tonight and say, way to go, buddy, because it is really tough for them. And they have a constrained financial environment because the money in Canada is organized vertically. The federal government has most of it. They give some to the provinces, and poor old municipal government left with not much. And it's particularly difficult when all that municipal governments rely on for their revenues are property tax and user fees. And a big chunk of those user fees are transit systems. And when nobody's getting on transit, or not nobody, lots of essential workers are on transit, but the bulk of traffic in transit's way, way down, which means the fare box is way, way down. And so main streets are essential to how we're going to recover. You cannot imagine people that want to fold up their hands and say, well, you know, we went through that phase and now it's going to be different. We're all going to shop online. It's just crazy, just craziness. Okay. We are fundamentally a species that congregates, cities. You could argue that cities are humanity's greatest invention. And it's not going to stop. It really isn't going to stop. What has to happen is we have to get really imaginative about how we need to do that in ways that are safe and ways that are just. And it's a moment. I think we're in this big, all of us in urbanism talk about pilots, that you can't make big change often. You have to try a little pilot, see if it works. Don't scare anybody, work out the kinks, and then you can go ahead and do it more of it. We're now in a big global pilot. And we better not waste this opportunity, is what I would say. The old phrase, don't squander a crisis. We better emerge from this in not just better, we better emerge in a different kind of way. And so I think Main Streets is a perfect delivery point for us to imagine what our future needs to be. Particularly when you think of a lot of people who feel quite helpless during COVID. They may not be in healthcare services. They may not be in immediate frontline service. And they're saying, well, what can I do? What's the future for us? And Main Streets is a really tangible way that everyone can get engaged in what the future of their urban community is going to look like and what the future of their urban economy will look like. So as I suggest, Main Streets are hubs of culture, social life, civic activity. As I suggested, faith institutions. Main Streets, a really healthy Main Street should surprise you. It should have things on there that you hadn't thought of. And it should have it should be of a scale that a new entrepreneur or a small, modest business can find a place on Main Street. And this is something that was happening before COVID that was a big challenge. If we start to see lots of new development, as you know, and so lots of people want new development. They want more housing, for instance, on Main Street, which I think is important. But sometimes that requires lot assembly. And if you get lot assembly and you have one developer coming in and they're working on a balance sheet that requires them to get lending, then the dilemma is going to be there'll be enormous pressure on them to put a certain kind of vendor on the retail floor. Often, what's called a Class A vendor. There'll be people on this call that know this dilemma better than me. And the dilemma then is you squeeze out independent businesses. We've got to find a workaround on that so that we can introduce and create spaces where an independent business can find a place, and that you don't end up just with big, large chains, which is what's tending to happen certainly in the cities that I travel in. That you end up getting just those big chains. And if my Main Street looks like your Main Street, we will have failed. We want Main Streets to look quite different, unique, quirky, fun, interesting, and helpful and useful to what the local community needs. The last thing is, as I'm suggesting here, is Main Streets support community inclusion, safety, and health. Here's one of the challenges, and I know you've got it in Victoria like crazy. Because commercial life is diminished, because we can't get out and shop safely, or people have a perception they can't get out and shop safely, or hang out safely. And I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas, the Credit, the Chippewas, and the Wendat peoples. And we are preoccupied here with how we actually come to terms with reconciliation and have our urban spaces reflect Indigenous values. And one of the Indigenous values that we need to reflect is inclusion. And the difficulty is if you have not as many diverse activities going on in main streets because the businesses aren't happening or the parks aren't safe, then you end up losing that diverse activity and that diverse user. And it means that it becomes it's less populated, which makes it less safe. Because if you think of Jane Jacobs, and thank you for crediting it earlier on in my bio, that I did work for a number of years on a project called Ideas That Matter, which was based on Jane Jacobs' ideas. One of the most important adages that she coined, and that we all say, and lots of people say, and they don't even know it came from her, is eyes on the street. The safest street is the one where there are a lot of eyes, a lot of people. And at the moment, our streets are increasingly empty. Or they're dominated by a person who is living on the street and needs mental health supports and is having trouble finding them, and there is nowhere else to go because the shelters are closed. You guys know this in Victoria better than anybody. So this, back to particle accelerator, we coexist with people that are struggling with mental health and addiction and need support, and also people that are not in that situation, have a different health profile, different socioeconomic means. And our streets are critical to kind of knit together a narrative of coexistence and collaboration in the city. I lived in New York for a number of years, and I can tell you that in New York City, you're aware of that pulsing cohabitation of people like me and people really not like me. And if we lose the capacity for main streets to be that connective tissue and to bring us together across difference, in New Orleans, where I also lived, along the main corridors, there's what I would call a boulevard. You know, the traffic goes one way on one side of the street, goes another way on the other side. In the middle, there's this strip, often quite wide, of grassy knolls where people walk their dogs or whatever they do. But in New Orleans, it's called the neutral ground. And the neutral ground was exactly what it says it was. It was a place. New Orleans was founded with competing cultural groups. They were competing culturally and by ethnicity and by race. And the neutral ground was a place where they could actually navigate together and negotiate together. And I feel like main streets have to resume their role as the neutral ground of urban life. So this is obviously what's happening. Some of you will recognize that book. You'll certainly recognize the shot to the left. And the question is, how are we going to be able to reimagine these places for all the reasons I've just suggested, not just economic? So we wrote this thing, bringbackmainstreet.ca, go look at it. You'll see, or go into Canurb, you can see it. And we created all these things with a gazillion partners. Many municipal governments supported it, business improvement areas, business improvement districts, and many contributed to it. And we've done the first phase and produced these things, a placemaking toolkit. There's a playbook on design, all at the website, please go. Tangible solution briefs, data tools, memos. Part of what we're doing here is making the case about why you need to bring back Main Street. Because believe it or not, there are people out there that don't believe this or don't know it. They just haven't thought about it. So we've been making the case that these are the kinds of, this is why it matters. Here's what's at stake. And then we have an action report also there that's going to suggest to folks what level of, if you're in government, here's what you should do. If you're in, if you're a business improvement area, here's what others are doing across the country. My organization, the Urban Institute, is focused on building connective tissue, different forms of connective tissue. In Canada, we do vertical really well. You know, municipal governments relate to the province, relates to the federal government. What we don't do well is we don't do this horizontal peer-to-peer learning. You know, Antigonish and Abbotsford don't have a lot of relationship. And so part of the challenge, I think, for me at CUI is how to my staff, my colleagues, is to figure out what new forms of infrastructure could we be creating so that if this community over here is doing something fantastic and that community has a similar problem, they could learn from each other and learn really quickly. And COVID has pushed us into that position where people are eager to figure out what the solutions are. Nobody has it figured out. And because of the technology that we have, thank goodness we have Zoom, even though it drives everybody crazy, it's allowing us to hear, learn, ask questions, collectively problem solve, which is part of what this Bring Back Main Street piece has to be about, is collective problem solving. So we've been trundling along with this, and as I said, working with partners all over the place and coming up with really fabulous, not us, but all our partners coming up with fabulous ideas about what's working and what isn't. And at the same time, we are starting to realize, and I'm sure you know this to be true, is that downtowns, commercial business districts, are really, really challenged. And we want to make the point here that it's not either or. If you invest in your main streets, which are often at the neighborhood scale, that doesn't mean at the expense of downtowns. So in different parts of downtown, you know, there are main streets on downtowns as well. And in fact, one of the points that we made about main streets is that no main street is alike, and a main street in one community might actually be a strip mall. It might be a suburban mall. It might be a Four Corners in a small community. It might just be an intersection. So interestingly, the concept of Main Street seems to resonate with people. They understand that it's a gathering place and it's sort of the place. And you may, in a large city, you have many, many, many main streets, but we have to concentrate on both. And the dilemma with Restore the Core is it again, dominated in some of our cases in Canada by one main use being commercial real estate. And that has made that neighborhood much more vulnerable because there aren't as many people living there. And the retailers that are set up there have been set up over years to basically service one client group, the commercial office worker. So if people aren't going into their offices, completely threatens all the ecosystem. Again, one of the questions that I would ask us to consider is, as we come out of this, are we going to be seriously, really seriously examining the potential of how you create a complete neighborhood, which means that every neighborhood, even downtown, becomes a place where there's more diverse activity, more diverse users, people living there, people playing there, people working there, different kinds of capacities. And similarly, my main street may become more diverse in use too. So co-working spaces don't all have to be in the commercial core anymore. They can be here. Public services could be here. I live on a main street. That's here, over here is the main street. I live on a main street in Toronto. So these are kind of a mashup of these concepts, which I'm just going to illustrate. If you look at the scale of the challenge in downtowns, and again, this is on our site, you can go to restorethecore.ca or Bring Back Main Street or CUI, and you'll find all this. This is the level of challenge we're dealing with. In Toronto, 90% of office workers not coming in, 90%. You can imagine there aren't many eyes on the street in these downtown areas. I don't know how many of you do like every day I go for a walk somewhere. It's quite striking what you see and what you don't see. And then there's the ripple effect of that, of people not going there, all these ancillary businesses. I don't need to tell you guys this, you all know it. Here's Montreal, 90% drop going downtown. When have you ever seen St. Catherine look like that? Never. Calgary is interesting because Calgary had started to experience shocks to its core in 2013. So in many ways, it was the canary in the coal mine on this story. It's had to reinvent its downtown already. It's been in the process of that. It's had to reinvent its tax base. Is there anybody from Calgary here? I'm sure they'll ask a question about this, or we'd ask them a question about the impact of having to move from a reliance on commercial tax, property tax, because they just couldn't, so they had to shift. And it's just getting worse there. Before COVID, Calgary had 400 empty office floors. That number will climb. Here's what Vancouver is looking like, a gorgeous skyline, of course, obviously, and I'm sure the Victorians get tired of the beautiful picture of Vancouver, but the dilemma, you'll see that the core for us has been primarily the big 6 cities, but it doesn't mean that you don't have your own version of this. And what I think we're really seeing in Vancouver, as I know we are in Victoria, is this question of who is on the street now, and is that making it much more acute what the mental health and addictions challenges are, and how are we going to tackle those in compassionate and effective ways? Because not only because those people are in need of support, but also because the economic impact of not having more diverse users and uses on the streets, that is a deleterious thing to the economy. And your little monocle tourism boost is going to take a hit if you're not able to actually figure out this piece around how you support people that need support. And I know that the mayor and others have been really seized with this, and there's lots for you to teach the country about how to have a new conversation, a fresh conversation about how to provide supports and leverage the assets you do have in ways that are equitable and compassionate. In Ottawa, they have a particular challenge here because they're predominantly, as I would think Victoria would be, lots of government workers. 40% of Ottawa's commercial space is by the Government of Canada. Government of Canada's not coming back until 2021. They got hit by that, but they also got hit by Shopify saying we're not coming back. I'm hearing a rumor that Shopify is softening on that. And other large employers that were putting a lot of people into the core all of a sudden saying, well, we don't need to come back. And I guess that's one of the dilemmas, folks, is people say, well, we may not need to. The question is, what are the implications of that? And also, what are the long-term implications of not going into an office or not having maybe I should phrase that differently, not having an office to go to. So maybe, does it have to be all or nothing? I'm not sure it does, actually. I think probably good Canadian way, we'll find a way to accommodate and moderate. So, and the same, and even in Edmonton, again, the same dilemma that people don't like going. Part of it is public safety, and part of it is what's going to attract people back. Because, of course, in larger cities, we've got, and I'm sure it's true with you as well, all the cultural activity that goes on in downtowns. You can't actually put a national ballet company into a neighborhood. You don't have the venues. So what is that going to look like? What's the future of live music? What's the future of live theater? What's the future of large cultural exhibits and that kind of thing? You can't actually decentralize everything. So this is another impact on downtown. And then the one I just mentioned and just referred to in passing is this dilemma around transit. We have the six largest cities in the country are about 65% of the GDP. If you add the South Island, you're dealing with probably 70% of the GDP. And those GDPs are generated completely dependent on people being able to get around and being able to get to work. And so we have transit systems operating now. And again, this might be an example of a particle accelerator in that maybe it wasn't such a good idea in Canada that transit is so dependent on user fees, on fare box. It's not true around the world. Canada, for whatever set of interesting reasons, it varies by province, continues to see that that the token into the fare box or the ticket, that money has to factor in a major way to the operation of these systems. Lots of places around the world are saying that's not true anymore, that in fact it's a national priority, or certainly a provincial priority, to have a functioning economy, and transit is the underpinning of a functioning economy. And so we're going to distribute the costs of transit differently. This is one of those big pre-COVID conversations that COVID may get us to a place where people can imagine it differently. So 3 types of main streets. I've just talked about each of them. There's a business district, there's the neighborhood, and then there's the small town main street. Again, depends on different interpretations, but for some reason, everybody seems to kind of get it, that they have a main street. And if they don't have a main street, I think they know that that's a deficit in their community. And then if you think of the components of main streets, or the elements of the main street, it's people, it's having a place, it's having anchor institutions, having business, and then having really good connectivity between people. This is what you need to make a main street work. If you've only got one kind of thing, I know we all talk about this. What happens when your main street becomes only nail salons? What happens when your main street, they all go through different phases. What happens when your main street is all of a sudden only sushi? And that part of the diversity piece, one of the ways that you offset that is you have other kinds of anchor tenants, a little theater company, a faith institution, a curling club, a daycare. Curling club, I had to throw that in, good Canadian reference. You have different kinds of micro activities that can take place. And part of it, and I know there are people from business improvement areas here, part of it is curating that and the extent to which we can encourage other kinds of activities. As I suggested, if you think of one of the great components of cities, it's serendipity. And main streets are hugely important to serendipity, because you strike, I'm sure you're all like me, you go into when you're traveling into a new town, you want to go and have a look at some main streets. And so you walk down one and you think, oh, look at this. And I never thought that I'd find back here. So you need all those components. And then, as I suggested, the things that were challenging us before COVID on main streets, a lot of people shopping with their fingers digitally, and often shopping with Amazon or one of the big retailers. The interesting thing is, through COVID, we've accelerated like crazy small businesses. And in some cases, if you think of shopping districts that may have an ethnic kind of history to them and a particular ethnic monocultural life to them, it may be that those mom and pop shops, they may have owned them for 50, 60 years, don't necessarily have the technological capacity to go digital. And so it's interesting to me that we're seeing as quick a digital take up as we can. I have a Chinatown near me and a grocer there. I just cannot imagine they'll ever go digital. But there are lots of businesses that can, or maybe the next generation of kid in the business can help. The other thing is that in successful cities, and I mean successful only in the terms of economic, where there's been more and more pressure, and we know Canadian cities across the country are growing quickly. And I can't imagine after COVID that isn't going to be the case. We have a stable government. We have all sorts of things. I don't have to tell you guys. We have lots of things that may continue to make it very appealing for people to come to Canadian cities. And that will continue to put pressure on commercial real estate. So do we need to look at other kinds of mechanisms to maintain the affordability of real estate on main streets, because you want it to be a place where independents can get in and can stay in? It's a dilemma. And then the ownership models, this is the succession question. If you're a barber, I have a barber underneath me, two over from me. He's had that business, he's 80, does not have a kid to take that business on. What happens to George and the barber, right? It's a dilemma. Similarly, we have real estate investment trusts buying up properties, and that's happening even more during COVID. So you're having more and more large institutional landowners. And again, I bet I have some REIT people on the call. I'll be interested to hear what you're seeing and what your perspectives are. How do we make sure that those large institutional investors have some sensitivity to, or have some mechanisms at their disposal to encourage that economic diversity and diverse use on their street? Otherwise, frankly, their investment will be squandered because they'll just end up creating a kind of monolithic, monocultural kind of activity, and they won't. It's a two-edged sword, because if you keep your area curated and mixed and diverse, the real estate values will climb. And so how do we hang on to that? I mean, I'm all for imagining really different kinds of ways of thinking about this. In Barcelona, they ended up, and in Venice is in this boat too, some of these big famous international cities, where they had vendors that had been there for years and years and years, and then the taxes change, all of a sudden the vendor can't afford to be there, and then all of a sudden those squares don't look like what they once looked like. And so in some cases, the city may have to step in, the municipality may have to step in and find a way to create a different kind of tax rate, or even a different kind of ownership structure. Maybe we're going to see some commercial land trusts come out of this. And as I suggested, this less diversity, more chains. NIMBYism is a huge challenge. It's everywhere. We've got to figure our way through this. Again, is COVID going to help us with neighborhoods understanding why it's important that they allow different kinds of use and users? Because NIMBYism to me, NIMBYism is one of the great restraints on creating really diverse neighborhoods of all kinds. And I always feel that if you can get a kind of collective sensibility, and COVID may in fact create that people realize that if you don't have a diverse space of use and user, you're more vulnerable. You will not be as resilient a community. And then, as we just talked about, and I know you're experiencing this in Victoria, what's manifesting on main streets is this constant tension around social inclusion and social exclusion. And what are the new ways we're going to be able to mediate that, provide services to folks, make sure that they have the kind of environments where they're safe and where they can get the resources they need, and at the same time have diverse activities and users around them. Libraries have been dealing with this for years, and now we're seeing it on main streets as well. And then there you go, changing role of anchors, libraries. Librarians have had to be, they're one of those professions that's had to morph. And now they were, before COVID, increasingly social workers. Now we really see libraries playing that extraordinarily important role to every kind of person. And people relate to libraries with different sets of needs and different kinds of challenges. And so I hope, boy, wouldn't it be great if we could see a double down in public commitment. And maybe we need the federal government and the provincial government to pay attention to libraries and realize that those investments in those kinds of anchor institutions are so critically important to communities being able to muck it up and be able to cope with what we're coping with right now, and have the services available to us and have access to community and supports that libraries provide uniquely. So as we look now and currently in COVID, you can see consumer confidence is an issue. People aren't traveling as much. We're not getting together. Small businesses are cash starved. The federal government has been trying to provide financial support with limited success, if I may say. They've had good financial support for people receiving a personal benefit CERB, but the rental subsidies, the wage subsidies have been much more difficult to actually get out the door. And as we suggested, all these social service and housing constraints, all the things that we were struggling with before COVID, now worse, safety, and then just a general sense of uncertainty. So it kind of sizes up. We need bold action, and we need action on all these fronts. We've got to get serious about placemaking, folks. We've got to start using all the energies and skills that we've got, planners, architects, engineers, artists, small business operators, to find a way to create places. And we should not waste this crisis to improve our places. And the only way that's going to happen is if we engage a lot of folks and we all bring whatever specific thing we've got to it. We need to continue to push this diversity piece. You don't want monocultural main streets. You do not need your main street to look like a suburban mall, with all due respect to the suburbs, just saying. The other thing is we don't have great data. One of the things that's been tough about us for Bring Back Main Street is that municipal governments don't have good data, and the provincial government certainly doesn't. So they don't actually know who's opening, who's closing, how long have they been there, how many people do they employ. One of the dilemmas with the rental assistance was that it was almost impossible to get the data that the government needed to be able to make sure they were distributing money fairly. So we need to think hard about this, and can we get business improvement areas and business improvement districts and whatever they're particularly called in your region, can we get them resources or in partnership with municipal government to collect better data so that we actually are making decisions based on what's really happening? The financial relief, as I've suggested, there need to continue to be stopgap supports, and we've got to somehow get off any ideological resistance to that. Good heavens, we're in a global pandemic. You want to have a main street to go back to when you finally emerge. And then ongoing support, as I suggested. There are issues, obviously, we've been seeing, this is within the provincial purview. I make a joke about this, what's going to stick post-COVID? What's the good things? What are the bad things? Like, there are things that we've temporarily done, and the sort of ones that people talk about are bike lanes. Oh, we should keep bike lanes, all that kind of stuff. One of the ones I have is I just think that we should continue to think about conviviality. And I noticed a couple of weeks ago, I was walking here, and there was no dining in at the establishment, and people were waiting for a table, and so they were standing on the sidewalk having a beer, like you do in the UK. And I was thinking, boy, in Ontario, who could have imagined? You can order a pizza and get the bottle of wine with it. And I know there are public health advocates that will tell me that that's risky, but I think it's illustrative that as for instance, the introduction of patios that we've been able to do and that are now being pulled away because, at least in this part of the country, because of snow, we were able to approve those things quite quickly. Things that, and same with bike lanes. And I know that you've done, Mayor Helps has done enormous stuff on bike lanes. We were always told it would take too long. We obviously can move more quickly than we realize. And so I think all of these things together, how the taxes will be reassessed, what kind of public investment are we making in placemaking, how are we encouraging, which we've been doing all summer, people to take vacations in their own jurisdictions, local tourism, all these things are lessons that we've been compelled to learn. And how do we hang on to them? How do we move forward and hang on to the best things that we've been learning? So lots of actions we can take, animation, placemaking. We've got to deal with vacancies, folks. This is a significant challenge. If you've got speculators that are hanging on to properties and keeping them vacant, this was a problem before COVID. In New York City, we had a vacant shop tax. We had to, because it would just became cheaper for a landlord to just carry on and have nobody in a building. And then you just have, the street becomes deader and deader and deader the more that you see those craft paper, white paper things, and it's boarded up and boarded up and boarded up. And you would try to talk to those developers and they'd say, well, I'm just going to wait. They'll just wait it out. Well, we've got to get rid of that. That's no good. And then all these kinds of things that we could be tangibly doing. Where are we on cultural value, on all the heritage components that we've got, all the different kinds of ways that we can take actions. Municipal government, again, Victoria's led the way on this. Procurement, as we come out of this, a lot of money will be spent by the federal, provincial, and the local governments if local governments find a financial fix. And so there's going to be, we all just have to hang on and recognize that there will be stimulus money that will be hitting the ground. The question would be, are we ready? Are we able to ensure that that stimulus money gets in the hands of independent entrepreneurs, minority businesses, family businesses? Is it getting in the hands of community animators who can do really imaginative things and it doesn't cost a lot of money, or park stewards, or this is my other little bugaboo. I really want faith institutions to get on the board here with us and start to recognize that they were having trouble managing their buildings anyway. Their congregations are diminishing. They provide extraordinary vital services, and they are a dynamic and a beautiful place often. And we need those faith institutions to step in and start to think about different kinds of stewardship models, different ways of expressing their ministry, regardless of what faith tradition they're from, so that we can continue to build the kind of community across difference and across different aspects of life and different socioeconomic strata. This is so critical. If we just think of a city, think of a main street as a little tiny little floret in a big cauliflower of the city. So you're going to work at that local level, and if enough of us work hyper local, before you know it, we start to build a whole cauliflower. So I think a lot of this is about messaging. We've started this thing, Main Street It Together, or In It Together. Again, let's do this. I really want to try to make it clear to people that we need to challenge people to engage. So if it's not safe for you to go outside, if you're being discouraged, as we are in Ontario, to not go out, you can still make your purchases online, but make them with the store across the way. And then let's start to imagine, if there is a business that's going to go under, and that maybe it was one that was struggling beforehand, or they're making a decision. There was a Chinese food restaurant 2 doors down from me. I saw that went down. I was very sorry about it. I went to talk to them. He said, "Oh, no, listen, we were ready to retire." Fine. So what's going to go in there? Can that be a local business? How can I patronize that local business to encourage them to be? And there are lots of businesses coming up with great schemes, buying clubs, subscription services, different kinds of peer-to-peer relationships. The big one, the bugaboo that we've all been concerned about, these usurious delivery charges that the big tech-enabled delivery services charge us. Well, now, sure enough, local restaurants are coming up with ways to deliver food locally, and I feel much better ordering that way than I did when I was having to use one of the other services. So, and if we're really serious about what we want to do, we want to encourage people to engage. We want to surface the best ideas. And then we have to think carefully about how we're going to inspire and encourage. And don't you feel that during COVID, a lot of this is just instilling a sense of collective purpose, and I would say even hope, that we're going to emerge from this in a new way, in an innovative moment. And how lucky are all of us actually to be alive at this particular juncture, to be able to see this. I've been saying to my staff, I'm 61 years old, and no question in my mind that the balance of my work life, which is going to be a while, I hope, is going to be completely impacted by what we've been witnessing. And I say to my young staff who are in their 20s and 30s, this will be the seminal work event of your life, and it will impact how you carry on and the contribution you make to building better cities. I was 45 when I was in New Orleans during Katrina, just after Katrina, and I knew at the time that would have an indelible effect, and that I needed to spend that time, eyes open, ears open, listening to the locals and hearing how they were going to reorganize themselves and reimagine their future. So all of us have to get engaged, the whole bailiwick of us. If you're not there, you need to be there. And I see private business as being practitioners. You're a practitioner just like everybody else is. And this is the potential that we could do. We could use this as a moment to really draw together, and draw together based on place. And we could be part of something bigger because we want to love our local. That's all I got. I'll stop sharing. And hopefully, Carrie will come back and we'll have a collective conversation, unless I put her to sleep.
I can't stop my video because the host is...
While you're looking, Carrie, I'm going to look at the questions and see what people are asking.
Hello, I'm here. Thank you so much, Mary Rowe, for a fascinating presentation. I could just listen to you talk all day. And in fact, I am going to get to hear you talk more at 12:30. Everybody can come on board for the Check Spotlight. Go to your Whova app and check it out and sign up. And I'm going to be talking to Mary and Kathy Witcher. I'm Carrie Slavens from South Island Prosperity Partnership. I'm going to be your moderator for the Q&A session of this. So please enter your questions in Q&A. This is an extraordinary chance to ask Mary anything you want to know, or almost anything. So here's one from Vern Raincock. Mary, I don't know how if there are stories from across the Cascadia or Pacific Northwest region that you're familiar with. But Vern wants to know, what is a good news story for Main Street in Cascadia that has blossomed since 2000?
Just the fact that you call your region Cascadia is extraordinarily important. When I was living in New York City, we were always trying, and it's hard when you're the big bad New York City. It's hard to have this conversation to say to people, we really want you to be part of our collective regional activity. But I think the idea that we think about this as a regional activity and that we allow ourselves to be in a situation where we don't necessarily we're not directly competing. This would be a big, huge shift in economic development strategy, that municipal economic development departments aren't scurrying around frantically trying to say, well, I want to get that plant to locate here. It's better that you come here than go there. And one of the ways that we started to see that changing, I think, was when, it's kind of perverse, but when cities and regions across the country were putting together Amazon HQ2 bids, and people started to recognize that the Amazon evaluation criteria, like even going through the process was probably very good for folks to do it, that they started to realize that going through the evaluation process, they realized, well, I probably don't have all of that, but my sister region might have the university assets, and this region might have the transportation assets, and this, and also just recognizing that, a contemporary talent pool is looking for a bunch of things. People, talent is deciding where it wants to locate, and there's an enormous talent competition for talent across North America. And you're in a region that has that really extraordinary opportunity, landscape opportunity and lifestyle opportunity, which makes you unique. That's not true for many, many cities. So I would say that I can't talk to the specifics. I'm assuming other people on this call probably can. And the Reboot Recovery Plan is certainly talking about building on existing assets, which is critically important to do. So one of the ways to sort of tease this out is this notion of positive deviance. I like that because it's sort of counterintuitive. But in a system, when you've got things happening, you need to look and say, well, where is there some flourishing? And you have I know Victoria better than I probably know other parts of the region, but in Victoria, you have quirky little areas that seem, and you all know these, they're all in your neighborhoods too, where you will see a different kind of arrangement. You'll see, oh, there's an interesting little restaurant, and then next to it there's a grocery store, and look, that's an independent, and gee, isn't it interesting they co-located a doctor's office in the grocery store. Like, I think we need to look and say, where are these exceptions and then how do you mimic them or scale them, and what were the conditions that allowed that really sweet area? So again, one of the things that I noticed in Victoria, but again, if you guys, where nobody's traveling now, but that the way in which you have neighborhood businesses right in residential neighborhoods. When I would walk around there, I would see that you'd come around and you'd be in a completely residential neighborhood. You come around a corner and there's a store and a restaurant and dry cleaners, and it's all there right in that residential neighborhood. That tells me that somebody's been really imaginative about understanding zoning. And I also saw some new proposals the time when I met Kathy. I saw some new proposals where a developer or a planner architect was coming in and trying to mimic that, and was actually creating a development that would have all those components. So I can't give specifics about the sort of gems that you're identifying, but others will be able to. And I think it's the right question to be asking, because you want to look at what's working and then figure out why is it working, and then figure out, well, how can I replicate? You don't want to duplicate and have everything look the same, but you say, what were the conditions that allowed it to flourish there, and how can I mimic them? I just want to, before you do, Carrie, I just want to respond to John Trelevan, who's saying, remember, Main Street businesses don't pay taxes. I understand, but their landlord does. And I'm assuming that if this is a particular Gordian knot for small businesses around the country, be interested to know what other people think of this. If we could create incentives or programs for small businesses to buy the building in which they are in, that creates more stability of tenancy. And it means that they're not at the whim of their landlord. They then have all sorts of their own dilemmas about whether they sell or not. But it does give secure tenancy. So 2 blocks down from me is a fabulous neighborhood restaurant bakery, quite small, called Bonjour Brioche. Anybody that's been to Toronto to the East End will know what I'm talking about. Bonjour Brioche, fabulous place, the best croissant, the best baguette, the best, all that stuff, great coffee. And they've been there for 23 years, one couple owning it. And they did not reopen for the longest time. And then eventually a little sign appeared that they were going to reopen for takeout only. They now run Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday takeout only. And I talk with her every week. And she has made it really clear to me that the only way she can do this is because she owns her building. So if we could create some kind of financial capital pool that would allow independent businesses to buy their buildings, and in other parts of the world, they get 100-year leases. So we just need to think about other mechanisms. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, and I just wanted to get to John's point about quite right that they don't pay, there's not a business tax that accrues to the city, but the landlord does.
No, I think I'm glad you addressed that. And, we have a question here from Amanda Garner. How do we encourage public participation in the initiatives to bring back Main Street? How do we get people to care? Have you had any luck with that kind of social marketing in, say, Toronto or?
Well, that's why we want to lead Main Street it together, because if we honestly, Amanda, if we can't engage regular folk right now in the middle of to use, excuse my French, a fucking pandemic, then when the hell can we, right? So I think we have to try to make it, the dilemma is you're trying to replace one kind of panic with a kind of urgency. People are very uncertain and panicked about COVID. So you don't want to contribute to the level of anxiety. And so that's why the angle that I'm taking is, here are some constructive ways that you can actually engage. So I don't know if anybody else is noticing this, but on Facebook now, people are putting up, hey, here's a shop that I shop in, and I'm going to do all my Christmas shopping in that shop online this year. Or I noticed a Twitter user. I'm not a follower of Twitter, but I have colleagues that do and make sure that I read it. And it was somebody, I think it was from the business improvement area in Winnipeg, who just sequentially tweeted examples of small business. So he or she, I think it was he took the handle of the small business and he said, this shop, I've been going there, here's what you get. New tweet, this shop, I've been going there, here's what you get. So I think obviously you don't want to just you don't want people to just participate financially. There are lots of people that don't have the means to participate financially, and you don't want to create it that it's only about consumption. But it seems to me that we have a moment now where we can engage people. We can engage them through their library. We can engage them through the essential services they need. We can engage them through nasty old social media and these caremongering groups. And I think that, just look at this. If you'd wanted me to speak, I think, Kathy, you may have actually asked me to speak last year, but if you'd wanted me to speak to your conference, and I would have had to fly across the country and book hotel rooms, and it was going to be a lot more labor intensive and more time consuming. And now you don't have to do that. You can just phone me up and tell me it's next Tuesday, and if I can come on, I'll come on. And I think the same is true for engagement now. There's really no excuse for us to not be really imaginative, and we can engage with people in all sorts of different ways. We can put something through their door the old-fashioned way. We can call them on the phone. We can text them. We can tweet. We can have these kinds of engagements. And I think because of the scale of the challenge, in New Orleans, to give you an example, after Katrina, 180,000 housing units lost. There was nobody who could sit on their hands. You basically needed everybody involved. It's a bit like a campsite, right? Anybody that's taken a camping trip or a canoe trip, you get out of the boats and everybody takes a piece of equipment up to the campsite. And I feel like that was a good little Canadian metaphor that I pulled out of the back of my brain. But I feel like that's the moment we're in now, is that we have to remind people that we're all in this together, that it has to be all hands on deck. And then we have to be, those of us that are stewards, have to find really interesting, flexible ways to engage people, because it's not just one way. It's going to be a whole bunch of ways. And if you think about inclusion and all the ways that public activity has tended to exclude people, either physically disabled or people that couldn't get there because they didn't have childcare, or they were working 2 jobs and they don't have time, that still may be the case, that there are some people that are just exhausted and who have so much required of them that they don't have extra time. But there are a lot of people who can find time now. And it's a big collective exercise. It's kind of a war effort without the war. Touch wood. It's not war. I'm trying to find some wood on my kitchen counter.
I love that. Mary, Sita Param has asked, what policies would help owner-operators to afford space on main streets dominated by franchise chains? I think this goes towards the diversity you're talking about on, you know, in terms of different kinds of businesses and different mix of businesses coming in there.
Yeah, well, this is the dilemma, right? And my buddy John is coming back with more on the tax. John, hi, John. I love you, whoever you are. The one thing would be whether we could get differentiated tax policy. I'm just going to answer him first because he's piqued my curiosity. If you could get different tax rates, you know, we have a highest and best use tax predilection in Canada, which is that if you happen to be on a site and you've got your tenants or mom and pop shops, but the tax assessors determine that you could be an 80-story condo, they'll tax you with the 80-story condo. We just got to throw that out the wall. And we've just got to understand that we can do differentiated tax. Now, the question that you're getting at, Carrie, having to do with diversity, yes, and how do you get a diverse kind of mix on a main street, right? And I think some of it is organic. I don't want us to go to a highly manicured, oh, well, that will be a nail salon and that will be a sushi shop and that's really difficult. And in fact, if you think of some of the most famous, appealing niche-like shopping areas internationally are places where there are 7 fabulous bookstores and they've grown up over time. And then you go, if you want books in Paris, you go to where Shakespeare & Co. is, and there are 6 other bookstores around here. And that was certainly true in New York as well. And in fact, organically in New York, when I was working there, one of the things that we were trying to find ways to protect were these districts, the flower district, the garment district, the jewelry district, and they had emerged in a kind of organic way to service a certain sector. And it meant that if you were a buyer or if you're a Broadway producer and you have a dress rehearsal and you need to overnight realize that all the chorus line, that the color of their shoes is wrong and you need to get it dyed overnight, you would go down to the garment district at 10 at night after the rehearsal and say, I need you to dye all these shoes magenta, please. And they would do it overnight. And then so there are some benefits to the conglomeration of like businesses. So if you think the tech sector now, you see buildings where there's a bunch of tech folks. Now, the dilemma is, if you have too much of a monoculture, then you diminish the input. You need lots of diverse inputs in cities. Because the tech sector doesn't know everything, right? And same with the garment district. They realize, oh, well, jeepers, we better find some flowers. So you want to have enough connective tissue that there's give and take. If you look at things like the Centers for Social Innovation and other co-working spaces, they have over years started to understand what the sort of magic sauce is for good curation. And so I think it's a bit of a both and. Some of it can be zoning. If you've got zoning restrictions that prohibit certain kinds of businesses coming onto main streets, I always challenge municipal bureaucrats to think carefully about that. They'll say, oh, the province won't let them. But you know what? You guys can force the province. You can make big cases to your province. If you feel that there are zoning rules that are precluding, for years, we didn't let businesses, lots of businesses couldn't locate in certain areas. And they had just prohibited uses. And I think those uses, noxious fumes and all the negative things that were going to come out of the business, it's very rarely the case now. So I've got to say, this puts me on the libertarian side of things, but I think that sometimes getting some of these rules off the books will encourage a certain kind of diverse user. And this is what I'm a little concerned about pot shops. Boy, oh boy, just how many pot shops do people need? I don't know. Do you need one on every block? That's what I think we're getting. And I think it'll level out though, presumably, but some of it is cyclical. And it may well be that municipal governments could be strategic and so could financial institutions, if I may say, if there are any on the call, they could get strategic about the kind of businesses that they want to actually support in strips so that you get a mix of things.
Yeah, great to hear your perspective on that. We have a question here from somebody else who says, I believe in the power of partnerships and wonder about your thoughts on how social profits or nonprofits and businesses can come together to support one another more strategically. How do you see the philanthropy part of it fitting in?
This is from Ms. Anonymous.
It is.
Partnerships are just critical. And in the United States, we're seeing more and more of these. In fact, civic alliances in the United States and American cities who are just more challenged than ours, historically, they've had a longer runway to deal with this. because they had capital leave cities. They had all sorts of racial dynamics that meant that cities became disinvestment zones. And so they've had a couple of extra decades to say, wait a sec, we got to get on the same page. We got to get business, and we got to get labor, and we've got to get community, and we got to get faith groups, and all of us together. So I think we may be staring down a moment where those kinds of partnerships are going to become crucial. As Canadians, we have this sneaky little tendency to say, well, government will do it. Boy, oh boy, how much can government really do, folks? Really? Like, how much can government do? So I think the South Island Partnership, I think all these different models that we're going to start to give more and more oxygen to say that we need more and more of these, all hands on deck. Universities are critically important to this. Educational institutions are important. Financial institutions and credit unions and alternate forms of capital accumulation are critically important to have that conversation and to have them driven by the community. So I think it's an all hands on deck, mix it up kind of thing. And philanthropy can play a really pivotal, important part there. They can provide startup capital. Philanthropists, be great to see more private philanthropists take risks. They by creating a foundation or making a philanthropic contribution, they get a tax benefit from doing that. And part of it is that they should then take some risks and try some stuff, because it's very hard for government to take risks. We don't want government to take risks. We don't want government to say, oh, I'm going to build that bridge a little differently, and then it falls down. We want folks like us that are doing more modest things to say, well, actually, I've been working on this little project and I tested it. I had some philanthropy to help me, and then I tested it to be good. And then once you figure it's good, then government says, oh, great, we'll do it then. So I think it's a critical point. And wouldn't it be great if we could get our community foundations and other private philanthropy to be a little more risk-taking?
Absolutely. We're coming to the end of our session. We have time for one more quick question, and I don't know if this can be a quick answer, Mary, but here goes. What about food and goods delivery service? Are they counteracting the idea of multi-distributed centers with shops and restaurants, or are they encouraging this idea?
We've all got to just get really smart about how we're spending our dough. And it's sometimes hard to know, isn't it? It's sometimes hard to know. You see something, it pops up in your social media feed, or a neighbor tells you about something, and you order online and it comes and you think, oh, that was convenient, that was great. I think that there are people whose circumstance is such that that's the service they're going to be relying on. And I don't think we should be holding those people, judging them. I think people make decisions based on what their financial means are and what their convenience needs are. But I can also tell you that on Facebook popped up in my little local East End Facebook group a thing about a guy who was renting a kitchen from a restaurant, a bar that was closed, and he was making savory pies and different things, shortbreads and curries. It was kind of a weird little mix of things. And I looked at it, and then there were people chorusing in saying, I've tried this guy and it's really good, and now we go every Friday and we get something. And so I wrote him, and I ended up ordering a meal. And I'm telling you, it was two-door. I live on a main street, and the back of my place is on an alley. And literally, the kitchen that he had rented is 2 doors down from me on a back alley. And it was a bit like knock 3 times, and the door opened, and then I was handed this meal. And I thought, wow, like we know how to do this, folks. Entrepreneurs have been improvising for millennia. We have been eking it out for millennia. And the question is, can we allow ourselves the gift of trying some new things and letting those informal systems, if you're in a high rise and there's somebody 2 doors down from you, 2 floors below you, that's making Indian food on Friday night, like, why not find ways for us to safely create those kinds of informal networks? And then that just ripples up in your building, in my back alley, in a neighborhood, in a district. And that's how we're going to rebuild this economy, folks, like one interaction at a time, one block at a time, and just allowing our places to kind of bloom in new kinds of ways.